Rav Mish, thank you so much for being with us. We're pre-recording, but we know that you are with us even in your dreams tonight in Israel. And it's a pleasure, of course, to have you with us. Thank you. It's a pleasure to have you with us and thinking about Pesach, which of course is something that you've written about. You literally wrote one of the many books on the holiday, and thinking about the connection between our community here in the United States and the diaspora, and thinking about your connection both to us and of course as a resident and so much part and parcel of what goes on in Medinat Israel. It's great to have you with us to think about Pesachs here and there and everything in between. So we're all yours. Teach us something interesting.
Great. Thank you, Rav Yona, and great to be here at the Oved Pre-Seder Learning. I'm not able to see all of you in real time, but I would love to hear your thoughts afterwards, and you can email me or contact me on Facebook. I'm excited to share some thoughts on Israeli and American immigrants reshaping the Seder, and through that to talk about Passover Seder as a night of storytelling and the different stories that we tell as Jews on Seder night. And for me, really, as someone who goes back and forth between North America and Israel when there's no COVID and there are airplanes and other things that we remember from our past life, I think often how much when we live in Israel or we live in America, we don't realize how uniquely special our own Jewish community is. Israeli Jews only really appreciate Israeli Judaism when they go to America and suddenly they're like, wait, Judaism in Israel is different. What do I think about that? And Americans often, when they go to Israel, they suddenly realize, wait, American Judaism has its own unique path, its own unique story. And what I want to share with you is a little bit how Passover night actually in Haggadot, created by Israelis and Americans, tell a uniquely American and Israeli story. And for me, of course, so much of this work is thanks to my father, who himself created a Haggadah in 1997 called A Different Night, together with David Dishon, Haggadah that I think is in so many homes in America, literally hundreds of thousands of copies used on Passover night. And when he created that Haggadah, I was 17. But when I was 22 and I was serving in the Israeli army, he turned to me and said, you know, so many people tell me that we should translate A Different Night Haggadah into Hebrew. But it's not enough to translate it into Hebrew. If we want to create a Haggadah like A Different Night in Hebrew, it needs to be an Israeli Haggadah. Because that's what Chazal teach us. They teach us, Lefi da'ato shel ben aviv melamdo. The Haggadah needs to be a dynamic text. The Seder needs to be a dynamic night of storytelling that is fit, specifically tailor-made to the audience that's there. So if A Different Night in America was tailor-made for an North American audience, Halayla Hazeh, an Israeli Haggadah that I created together with my father in 2004, was tailor-made for an Israeli audience. And so already I have this awareness of how Passover and the Passover story are different. We then created another Haggadah in English called A Night to Remember, which brings back so many of those Israeli insights back into the American context and does some new stuff as well. But what I want to do today is take you actually to a whole different realm. And that is to start by going back almost 150 years to one of the first Haggadot published in America. And it's called the Chicago Haggadah, 1879. I believe it's the third Haggadah to actually be printed and published in America. And the first one created by German Jews who from 1840 started to come to America and follow sort of the railroad into the Midwest. My own great-great-grandfather came, the Schweid family came from came from Germany and made their way slowly across into Minneapolis. But this Haggadah from 1879 reflects in such a powerful way the way immigrants retold the Passover story through the Seder. What do we see in this picture? Here is a family sitting, a father and a mother, wearing white, as the German Jewish tradition is. The father's wearing a kittel, right, like on Yom Kippur. He has a traditional headdress on that German Jews used to wear. If he was a chazan, he would also have like a little circle on top. And together with them sits the wise son, right? There he is reading a book. And when I show this picture to people, I always ask them sort of, just take a look at this, tell me who's the Ben HaChacham, who's the Ben HaRasha, who's the Tam. And immediately people notice, well, the guy is smoking is obviously the Rasha, but also notice how the energy in the room is taken up by the Rasha. That the Ben HaRasha is the one who their younger children are looking at. And in many ways, this is a picture of Arbat Banim, but really it's a picture about how immigrant families have a tension, an intergenerational tension in the family. And how so many immigrant families, Jewish immigrant families, specifically in America, but really it's true for Jewish Israeli immigrants as well, and for immigrants to this day, no matter what their background is, that it's usually the children who acculturate very quickly to the local society, reality, and norms, and the parents are kind of left behind. So here's an interpretation of who the Ben Harasha is. The Ben Harasha is the one who quickly acculturated to America. He's wearing modern clothes. He's not wearing a kitzel. He's in black, while the good parents and the good son are in white. And he's smoking, and which is what an American modern gentleman would do. But look at his body language. Look at how he's sitting back, raising his hand, and you can literally hear him before he falls off his chair backwards. He's saying, Ma avodah zot lachem, who needs this Jewish tradition? I'm a modern man. I don't need any of this tradition. And also notice how the number 3 and number 4, the Bena Tam B'Sheinu that Ishol, perhaps are looking at him, and he's the one who they're admiring. And I can't help but wonder that perhaps the illustrator here is actually being critical of the Ben Harasha, but he's also being critical of the parents who are kind of frozen in time, non-communicative, not dynamic, and don't realize that if they don't change up their Passover Seder, they're going to find themselves with a very different family, Jewish family, in the coming years. So the Chicago Haggadah is really a moment in time that encapsulates so much of what American Jews have struggled with over the years. But what I want to do with you right now is to actually just go back a little bit in the story and ask, wait a second, if we're to understand how immigrants understood the Passover Seder, we have to ask for a second, what is the goal of Passover? Why are we doing this whole thing? What constitutes a successful Passover Seder? And I would contend that for Chazal, it was very clear that Seder night has one clear goal. That the goal of Seder night is something that is actually recited in the Mishnah and Pesachim and recited in the Haggadah itself. A successful Passover night is not just about eating this amount of matzah or that amount of maror. We can be yotze on Passover night with all kinds of mitzvot, but there's only one mitzvah that makes Passover night a successful one, and that is if we can say at the end of the day, I too left Egypt, and that's what we read in the Mishnah. B'chol dor v'dor chayav adam lirot et atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa mimitzrayim. When I can, in every generation, one is obligated to see oneself as one who personally went out from Egypt. On Passover night, we tell stories. But the goal of stories is usually to remember the past. Here, Chazal say, we don't want you just to remember the story of the past. We want you to tell the story of the past to your children. And we don't want you to just tell the story of the past to your children. We want you to see the story of the past as if it's something that happened to you personally. That I'll leave the Passover table and I'll say, this story happened to me. And in so many ways, this was the challenge of immigrants as well. Because immigrants move from place to place and they're raising children in a new world, and they know that their children aren't growing up with the same experiences. And that's exactly why Moshe Rabbeinu says, when you get to the land of Israel, your children will ask you, what are you doing? Why are you doing these things? And then you'll be able to tell them, I have a story and memories that you don't have. But I want you to feel like you're a first generation Yotzei Mitzrayim. And we've been doing that for 3,000 years now. We've been retelling the story again and again to make it a story that the next generation really feels as if that it's their own. When we created Halayla Hazeh, the Israeli Haggadah, and then A Night to Remember, we asked our illustrator to draw for us a picture of how it would look like. What does it look like to create a Bechol Dor V'Dor experience? So what he did was he drew a family of Israelis who on Passover do what many Israelis do. They go down to Sinai for Passover to be on the beach and hang out and have a nice holiday. And as they're going down to Sinai, they meet another family that's leaving Mitzrayim. And they're on the Israel-Egyptian border. These two families meet, a modern family and a biblical family from 3,000 years ago. And yet when you look at the families a little bit closer, you realize it's the same family. The father, maybe with a beard in one and long hair in the other. One has a dog, the other one has a camel, but altogether, it's the same family. And that's the goal of Passover night. goal of Passover night in so many ways is that the next generation holds the stories of the previous generations and makes it their own. Now, stories are so important for the Jewish people, but the way we tell stories are unique. And I think the way we tell stories are perhaps most embodied in Passover night, because Chazal realized that if we want the next generation to feel that Passover night is their own experience, beguf rishon, that it's they themselves left Egypt, then we need to not just tell a story, we need to create a full-bodied experience. We need Passover night to be not just oral storytelling, it needs to be play storytelling. It needs to be questions and riddles and rhymes. There needs to be games. We're going to steal the matzah, steal the afikoman, that is the holiest object. We can't finish the night without it. We can't fulfill the mitzvah of afikoman. And yet, as the Rambam says, chotfin matzah ze midei ze beleil seder. So we turn the story into a full body experience. We tell the story, we sing the story, we play the story, we quiz the story, and we also eat the story. Right? We're eating the same menu that our ancestors ate years ago. And in all those ways, Passover night becomes a full body experience, and the story itself becomes a story that we are embodying in so many ways. And yet, Jewish memory is not just about a full bodied experience, it's also about connecting past, present, and future. And the way we do this is through halach ma'anya. At the very beginning of the Seder, we reveal the matzah and we talk about the past, how the past informs the present, and how the present helps us imagine the future. Let's read it together. Halach ma'anya, diachalu avhatana be'arad mitzrayim, kol dichfin yetei ve'echol, kol ditzrich yetei ve'yifsach. First, we talk about the past. This is the bread. The same bread we're eating tonight is the same bread that our ancestors ate 3,000 years ago. I'm going to feel in my mouth the taste that my ancestors felt 3,000 years ago. But it's not just a memory of something that was. Our past informs our present and leads us to action in the present. If we are really the children of people who left Egypt, then we have to make sure that anyone who is hungry comes and eats, that anyone who is in need comes and shares the Pesach meal. And so we act, we turn our memories into ethics, into mitzvot, into chasadim. But we don't only do that, we also imagine a future. When you have a good story, it shapes your present, but it helps you imagine what the future can look like. And so our story tells us that the future is about going to Eretz Yisrael. That our future is about freeing slaves wherever they are and freeing any enslavement within ourselves. This year we are still slaves, next year free people. So just to recap, how does the storytelling work on Passover Seder? First of all, it's a storytelling that is not just about the past. It's not about something that happened. It's about something that's happening to me, that happens to me in the first person. How do I get my children to experience a story from the past that happened in a land that they don't live in, that happened in a past that they can't imagine? How do I make them feel like it's their own experience? I make it a full-bodied experience. I make it eating and singing and dancing and quizzing and learning and being very meticulous about what we do, and that's how you make it a full-bodied experience. But it's not just about making it a full-bodied experience in the first person, but it's about turning our memories into actions, into ethics, into kol ditzrich yetei ve'echol, and it's about imagining our future in a totally different way. So that's sort of I think, the DNA of Passover Seder. And what I want to do now is just share with you two ways in which Israeli and American Jews experienced and reshaped the Seder. If Passover night is about retelling the story of the previous generation for the next generation, well, we can actually understand that Arbat Abanim are four different responses that we all would have if our father or mother was now trying to tell us a story. We have the response that says, oh, tell me more, this is so interesting. Haben hachacham. We have the response that says, everything you're teaching me is not relevant, I'm not interested in this. Ma avodah zot lachem. Haben harasha. We have the response that says, oh, curious, mazot, I don't really know, I'm not that invested, but I'm curious about it. Or rather, I'm happy to just take this in a wide-eyed way, tell me it all, I'll drink it up. And finally, Sheina Daddy showed the place where we can't even communicate about the story. Four children, four different responses to hearing the story of our ancestors. But Rabbi Yitzchak Nissenboim would always tell about how the four children are also four generations. of how we see throughout the 20th century how the 4 children are 4 different generations. And we asked our illustrator, Michel Kishka, in the Haggadah to draw these 4 generations, and he drew it as 4 generations of Israeli women. The first generation, Haben Chacham, Haisha Chachama, is reading her Tehillim book. She's our traditional Jewish bubby. Her daughter is already an Amos Oz reading Zionist, secular Zionist, smoking her cigarette, and the puffs of her smoke make out the word lo. I'm not interested in the Tehillim of your Tehillim, bubby. I want to read novels. I want to be part of modern life, but I'm reading, high-level literature. Her daughter is not reading a novel anymore. She's reading a newspaper that says Mazot. And in that, she's sort of reflecting a new generation that is, to the mind of our illustrator, much more superficial. Today, perhaps she would be looking on her phone through social media. And the 4th generation, well, we don't really know what the 4th generation is going to do. She's sitting under the table reading a book upside down. But the book she's reading in this case is Sir HaSirim, which is an Israeli famous book about how to potty train your children. But it's called Sir HaSirim, like Shir HaShirim, the Megillah that we read on Passover night. So maybe the 4th generation, and this is what Rabbi Yitzchak Nissenboim says, the 4th generation, Sheino Yodea Lish'ol, will probably change the mutinies and the rebelliousness of the previous generations and create something new that we don't know what it is yet. And the truth is that as Israeli families sit at the table, we can now look at Haggadot that reflect different generations of Israelis. The first generation of Israelis that came here usually came not just with Hebrew, but they came with the languages that they spoke in their lands. Many great-grandparents at Israeli Passover Seders would sit down with an Arabic Haggadah or a Yiddish Haggadah or an English Haggadah, a Haggadah in a different language that could bridge the Rabbinic Hebrew for someone who doesn't speak Hebrew on a regular basis. Their children already created new Haggadot, and the most famous new Haggadot that were created in the land of Israel in the 20s and 30s are the Haggadot of the Kibbutzim. And here's an Haggadah from Givat Brenner, 1935, where they changed the words of the Haggadah to talk about their own questions. The 4 questions became questions that Israeli Zionists were asking today. Why do we have to take up arms? How long will they continue to kill us? Will we ever get our own land? Will there ever be Aliyah Chofshit? These were the questions that the kibbutz movement said, tonight, our 4 questions are different from the traditional 4 questions, but they are Jewish 4 questions that we have to ask tonight. So there was a renaissance of kind of writing new Haggadot in so many ways. I think once the state of Israel was created, we saw less creativity, and we started seeing just, Haggadot by rote. And the last generation of Israeli Haggadot is the creative one. Our Haggadah is part of that Haggadah Israelit. Here's an example of a Haggadah of daughters. V'higadet halepitcha. We see an enormous amount of creativity. So 5 generations of Israeli Haggadot. And if you think about it, they're also mimicked in the same way by 5 generations of American Haggadot. We already talked about the Chicago Haggadah, the 4 children of immigrants who are fighting the old tradition and the new tradition. I think the 2nd generation of American Jews are the Manischewitz Haggadah. They don't remember the German Jewish tradition or the Russian Jewish tradition or the Polish Jewish tradition. They are very American, consumerist. They're interested in their American products, their Manischewitz, their Maxwell House Haggadah, their American coffee, and the many editions of the Maxwell House Haggadah, I think today are still the most popular Haggadah in America. There's nothing wrong with them except for that they're unimaginative. Their externality is totally American, but internally, they kept the traditional text without really trying to rethink it. The most radical rereading of the Haggadot is a Haggadah called the Freedom Seder, which in many ways, written by Rabbi Arthur Waskow, kind of a precursor of Jewish renewal. It's the 60s Haggadah, it's the Black Panthers Haggadah. It's all about how we're actually rebelling against the tradition by retelling a Jewish story. And in some ways, the Freedom Seder, Waskow's Freedom Seder, which goes to all kinds of lengths to take the Jewish story to new realms, really reflects to me the Kibbutz Haggadah that also was very creative and rebellious in its way. And then today, again, we see a new generation of creativity. A different night that came out sort of started that creativity of you can create your own family Haggadah. You read the traditional text, but alongside it, you also add your own traditions. And today, many people use Haggadot.com. They don't need a book anymore. They're just creating a website and printing it out so that everyone can create their own Haggadah. So 5 generations of American Haggadot. But all these Haggadot, I think, really bring us back to one basic question, which is, what is the story that we want to tell this year on Passover? And as we end a year of living with COVID, I think in so many ways, we've learned a lot about how to run a Passover Seder. But more than that, we've also learned about how much the Jewish story is, at the end of the day, a story that parents tell their children. Last year, and in many ways this year, we're realizing that we can't celebrate Passover with our extended family. We can no longer count on the Saba and the Safta, the Bubby and the Zaidi to tell the story to our children. It's up to us. We're sitting in nuclear families because we're socially distant from our wider families. And we realize that on Passover night, every family, every group of parents are the ones who need to tell the Jewish story and get their children to say they too left Egypt. Hopefully these 5 generations of Israeli Jews and American Jews can give us inspiration to think in our own way of how we retell the Passover story this year.
Thank you so much, Yashar Koach. I'm thinking about my own family experience, where as American Jews, I'm the grandson of Holocaust survivors. And, you know, I remember having Sederim with my grandparents from Poland, with my grandfather who came here after the war, who lost his family before the war in Krakow, and his experience of Pesach and what did that mean and what was that like? And then being able to share that in some way with our children who are named for those people. And what do we do with that as still feeling as Toshavim, as people who live in this country, but certainly immigrants still with that story. And just imagining the different Haggadot of different generations, and also the different Vihigadatas, as you pointed out, the different tellings of the story.
You know, I think that's a great point. I think one of the differences is, for Israelis, Passover night is not a night where the Holocaust is front and center. Partly because we have Yom HaShoah 2 weeks later. But for many American Jewish families, Passover night is the time to do V'higadat Rabincha, about the Holocaust stories as well. We're talking about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, telling the family stories of how we eventually survived and those who didn't survive in the Holocaust. So adding that into the story is absolutely a big part of our generation. And as the last generation who will probably know Holocaust survivors, it really gives us a big obligation, a biblical obligation, to continue this story.
I'm wondering, as a final question, after a great presentation, any thoughts on the propriety of bringing in social justice stories of going back? There are stories of the sermons that were given, for example, during the Civil War by rabbis talking about slavery. And certainly the narrative of the past number of decades in the United States of Avadim Hayinu is in many ways a narrative that has been taken on, and I think appropriately, by the non-Jewish community, specifically the African-American community. But what does that do in terms of our experience? Do we bring that experience into the Seder? Is it too foreign? What are your thoughts on that?
You know, I think Professor Jonathan Haidt talks about how there are 2 basic stories that the modern world tells. Some people tell a conservative story and some people tell a progressive story. The progressive story is, in the past, everything was dark, discriminatory, racist, and misogynist, and we're slowly making our way into the light, right? And we're slowly taking away a tradition and the old ways of the world, and we're more and more free and more liberated. It's a progressive story, and many Jews tell that story in so many ways. And then there's a conservative story. The conservative story says, things used to be simple. Things used to be clear. My grandmother and my grandfather were good people, and they knew how to act. And if I could be more like my grandparents, that would make me happy. Now, for some people, that's about small town America, but maybe that's about Binyan Beit Midrash. You know, the time when we were in Eretz Israel and there was a Beit Midrash and everything was clear. And the truth is, I think those 2 stories that in America and in Israel often feel like 2 different stories, in the Jewish tradition, we have both of those stories. And on Seder night, we tell both of those stories. We say, we miss the Mikdash, and we wish we could rebuild it. We miss Eretz Israel, and we wish we could return to the simple reality, right, of being back in Eretz Israel and living that kind of whole life. And that's why we hold on strong to our traditions, and we eat the same matzah and the same ma'ol, and we say the same text. That's how we're going to survive through this very confusing galut until we can go back to where we belong. And that's the conservative story. And at the same time, we also tell a progressive story. We used to be Avadim b'Mitzrayim, and then we are on our way to Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael is always something we're going towards. Even I, who live in Eretz Yisrael, I'm going towards Eretz Yisrael, right? Hashata avdei l'shana haba b'nei chorin. And Passover is all about opening the door for the other. If I'm okay on Passover, but my neighbor, Jewish or not, is starving, that is not okay. And figuring out how we widen the Jewish story and think how amazing it is that Jews told a story to the world that African Americans, that French revolutionaries, that Christians and Muslims are telling in new ways in order to create more freedom in this world. What could fill us more with pride on Passover night than that? So what I love is that in so many ways, many American Jews and Israeli Jews can tell only a progressive story or only a conservative story. And to be fair, I think actually part of being modern Orthodox is about saying I tell the progressive story and I tell the conservative story. And when we look at our Haggadah, it has both of those stories. I really think that's what the Kodesh Baruch Hu wants of us in this generation.
Your Haggadah and here where I'm standing in our Beit Midrash both represent that opportunity, that potential, and then that fulfillment really of bringing all those values together in the way that we get to do that. So thank you so much for your time, for your amazing teaching and for your inspiration. And we look forward to continuing the conversation in the future.
Thank you, Rabbi Yonah. Pesach Sameach.
Chag Kasher v'Sameach. Kol Tuv.